On a hot July afternoon in 2011, 23-year-old Alicia Navarro and her boyfriend, 24-year-old Brian Keller, drove out of Albuquerque in Brian's aging Jeep Cherokee. Friends later said they wanted to escape the city for a weekend in the high desert to camp near the edges of the Manzano Mountains where the scrubland meets the old forest roads. They carried a cooler, sleeping bags, and a camera they had just bought with the idea of documenting their trip. That night, they texted Alicia's sister a picture of their campfire, their smiles illuminated by the glow. It would be the last message anyone received. By the following evening, their phones had gone silent. When Alicia failed to show up for work at a local bookstore and Brian missed his shift at a mechanic's shop, families alerted the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department. A missing persons report was filed on July 10th. Initial search efforts treated the case as a routine lost hiker situation. Deputies found Brian's Jeep parked at a dirt pull-off off State Road 337, keys still inside, cooler half full, and 2 camp chairs folded neatly in the back. Their sleeping bags were gone, suggesting they had set off on foot. The first sweep by ground teams covered 5 miles of trail in all directions. K-9 units picked up scent traces leading into the pinyon pines, but lost them at a dry creek bed. The search log from that day records, "Scent terminated abruptly at Sandy Wash, no continuation. Helicopter flyovers produced no sign of tents or fires. Witnesses provided fragments. A rancher south of Treacherous reported seeing a couple matching their description walking off trail late in the afternoon, moving quick, like they were trying to get somewhere before dark." Another hiker recalled hearing voices in the canyon after sunset, though he couldn't distinguish words, only a man shouting once, then silence. None of these sightings were verified. By July 12th, the official search expanded. 40 volunteers joined deputies and the New Mexico State Police, combing ridges and arroyos under blistering heat. Dispatch transcripts captured the frustration. Unit 4, negative visual. Unit 6, dog circling, refusing forward. Reports of sudden equipment malfunctions emerged, radios cutting out, GPS units flickering and resetting without reason. The anomalies were noted but explained away as interference from the terrain. Then came the detail that shifted the case. 6 days after the disappearance, an independent search group flying a drone along the mesa edge captured aerial footage of what appeared to be objects laid out in a distinct pattern. When investigators reached the site on foot, they found pairs of shoes, men's and women's, hiking boots and sneakers, arranged in a near-perfect spiral spanning 20 feet in diameter. At the very center lay 2 smaller shoes that Alicia's family identified as hers. There were no footprints around the formation, no disturbed soil, no evidence of how the shoes had been placed. The official log reads simply, "Recovered footwear, anomalous arrangement." Photographs of the scene were sealed in the case file. Only one blurred image leaked years later, showing rows of shoes curving into a spiral against the sand. Forensic teams examined the footwear. Most pairs were not Alicia's or Brian's. They varied in size, brand, and wear, some so degraded they appeared decades old. One boot bore a manufacturer's label, discontinued in the 1970s. Soil samples from inside the shoes showed no uniformity, as if they had been collected from multiple locations before being placed together. FBI specialists were called in under the pretext of artifact analysis. Their presence was noted in the sheriff's daily report, then scrubbed from later summaries. The discovery reignited local legends. Elders from nearby pueblos spoke of the spiral watchers, figures said to lure travelers off familiar paths, leaving behind shoes as offerings. Historians connected the symbol to ancient petroglyphs etched into canyon walls miles away, spirals long interpreted as markers of portals or journeys. Rangers, reluctant to discuss it publicly, admitted off-record that this was not the first time shoes had been found arranged in deliberate shapes in the wilderness. Despite the strangeness, the official narrative downplayed the find. Press releases mentioned unrelated footwear and no evidence of foul play. Families were told the shoes might have been discarded by other hikers over the years. Alicia's mother refused to accept the explanation. "My daughter's shoes were at the center. That doesn't happen by accident." As the weeks passed, the case stalled. No bodies, no further clues. Yet, the spiral remained an open wound in the investigation, a detail authorities seemed determined to suppress, while independent investigators treated it as the key. In the silence, speculation grew. Were the couple victims of a crime, drawn into some ritual, or had they stumbled into something older, unrecorded, hidden in the desert ridges? The spiral of shoes remains one of the most unsettling artifacts in modern missing persons investigations in New Mexico. To this day, the official file closes with the line, "Subjects not located." But for those who have seen the blurred drone image, the question lingers like heat over the desert stone. What really happened out there in 2011, and who, or what, arranged the spiral that marked their absence? The first 72 hours after Alicia and Brian were reported missing were chaotic, marked by a mix of urgency and confusion. Deputies coordinated with the New Mexico State Police to establish a command post near the pull-off where the Jeep had been found. Search grids were drawn on laminated maps, radio channels assigned, and volunteers paired with experienced trackers. The logbooks from July 11th reveal repeated frustrations, heat index rising, canine teams struggling, and searchers requesting additional water resupply. Conditions were brutal, with triple-digit temperatures during the day and sharp drops at night. Teams fanned out along the ridgelines, moving slowly through mesquite and cactus thickets. The scent trail detected on the first day seemed promising, but evaporated quickly in the sandy wash. One handler noted his dog alerted strongly, then froze, tail down, refusing to move. This behavior was recorded twice, once in the arroyo north of the Jeep and again near a stand of junipers. Rangers marked the spots but found no footprints, no clothing scraps, no gear. Helicopter crews circling the mesa edge at dusk reported flickers of light below, like campfires, but when ground teams approached, they found no ashes or evidence of recent activity. A dispatch transcript at 22:43 recorded, "Visual anomaly, unable to confirm, possible reflection." Pilots later admitted the lights had seemed too steady and too far apart to be random glints. No official explanation was added to the file. Witness interviews continued to surface. A retired teacher hiking near Cedro Peak claimed she saw two figures moving off trail the evening of July 9th, walking fast and carrying nothing visible. She described them as side by side, then one stopping as if to listen. She didn't report it at the time, assuming they were just day hikers, but after the news broke, she came forward. Investigators checked her timeline. It matched the window when Alicia and Brian would have been in that area. Family members grew frustrated with the lack of progress. Alicia's mother pleaded with officers to release more details to the public, but sheriffs resisted, citing the need to protect sensitive elements of the investigation. What those elements were remained undisclosed. Brian's father organized his own small group of friends to sweep side canyons, but deputies warned them against interfering with official operations. On the third day, a new anomaly was noted. Searchers found what looked like a faint trail of shoe prints leading toward a ridge. But when measured, the prints were mismatched, some too large to belong to either missing person, others oddly shallow, as if pressed without weight. The trail ended abruptly on a flat rock surface. Investigators photographed the impressions, yet in later files those images were categorized as environmental misreads. Radio logs from July 12th contain another entry scratched in hurried handwriting. Team Bravo reporting unusual cairns, stacked stones, not typical trail markers, arranged in 3 rows pointing east. No photographs were included, and no follow-up appeared in the case file. When questioned years later, a volunteer remembered the cairns vividly, describing them as too deliberate, like someone wanted them to be seen. By the end of that week, the search effort had covered more than 30 square miles. Not a trace of clothing, food wrappers, or personal belongings was recovered. Search leaders began shifting the narrative toward possible voluntary disappearance. But in the margins of the internal reports, handwritten notes betray another tone. Too many inconsistencies, not a simple lost hiker case. The desert was closing in, swallowing evidence with wind and heat. Yet beneath the routine search protocols, fragments of something stranger were emerging. Odd footprints, cairns, lights, and dogs that refused to move forward. For those who walked the ground, it felt less like they were searching for two missing people and more like they had stepped into a place where the rules of explanation were slipping away. By the second week, the search officially scaled back. Deputies insisted resources could no longer justify the operation without new actionable leads, but the families interpreted it as abandonment. Volunteers continued alone, guided only by word of mouth and local maps passed between them. These civilian efforts unearthed details the official search had either missed or quietly filed away. On July 18th, a small volunteer team flying a consumer drone over the dry scrubland south of Juan Tomas spotted something unusual. The footage revealed objects glinting in the sun, aligned in a deliberate pattern not visible from the ground. When coordinates were relayed and teams moved in, they discovered what would later become the central mystery of the case: a spiral of shoes, dozens of them, winding inward across the sand. At its center were Alicia's white canvas sneakers, dirt-streaked but recognizable by the colored laces her sister had given her weeks earlier. Brian's work boots sat just beyond them, side by side. The spiral formation covered nearly 20 feet. Some of the footwear appeared modern, others decades old. A single boot bore cracked leather and a faded manufacturer's stamp discontinued in 1979. None of the shoes showed footprints leading in or out, as though they had been lowered into place from above. Soil technicians later confirmed that the sand beneath them was compacted and undisturbed, inconsistent with dozens of objects being arranged by human hands. Radio dispatches from that day, preserved in fragments, capture the unease of responders. Unit 14 to command, confirming footwear array, advise on protocol. A long pause, then, document, recover, no speculation. Photographs were taken, but when released years later through a redacted FOIA request, entire sections of the images were blurred beyond recognition. The FBI entered the case quietly after this discovery, citing the possibility of ritualistic criminal activity. Agents collected the shoes in evidence bags and transported them to Quantico. Forensic analysis noted a bizarre detail. Soil and plant matter inside the shoes came from multiple regions of New Mexico, not just the Manzano Mountains. Some samples even match soil types near Chaco Canyon, over 100 miles away. No explanation was ever given for how these objects converged in one spiral. Locals recalled older stories after the discovery. Pueblo elders spoke of spirals carved into petroglyphs, markers of portals or passageways. A retired ranger mentioned two other incidents from the 1980s, where hikers reported stumbling across shoe circles deep in the backcountry, though those reports were never added to official logs. Each time, the formations were dismantled quickly and attributed to vandals. For Alicia and Brian's families, the spiral was unbearable evidence. Alicia's mother said in interviews, "If her shoes were there, she was there. Where is she now?" But authorities refused to link the spiral directly to their disappearance, calling it an unrelated artifact. The phrasing angered the families, who believed the spiral was the only tangible sign left behind. Theories spread fast. Some suspected cult activity, pointing to the deliberate geometric arrangement. Others argued the couple may have stumbled into a remote community that staged the spiral to frighten or mislead searchers. But independent analysts who reviewed the drone footage insisted the formation appeared too clean, too precise, to be rushed work. By the end of July, the official narrative had shifted further. Press conferences stressed the dangers of the wilderness, heat stroke, wildlife, disorientation. The spiral was never mentioned publicly, only in sealed reports. Families were told little more than, "No bodies, no crime confirmed." But among those who saw the shoes firsthand, the impression remained that something beyond explanation had been uncovered. A silent pattern in the desert, marking the place where two young lives seemed to vanish into the heat and stone. By August, the official search was all but over. Deputies had pulled back, FBI teams had withdrawn, and the press conferences dwindled into silence. Yet the spiral of shoes remained, hanging over the case like a shadow that no one in authority wanted to acknowledge. Families were left with fragments. Alicia's sneakers and Brian's boots sealed in evidence bags, forensic reports heavily redacted, and vague reassurances that no direct connection to a crime had been established. For the families, those words sounded less like closure and more like evasion. Civilian volunteers, unwilling to let the trail go cold, returned to the site where the spiral had been found. What they encountered added another layer of strangeness. Within weeks of its discovery, the ground bore no sign that dozens of shoes had ever lain there. Sand was smoothed, brush had been cut back, and stones had been rearranged. It was as if the desert itself, or someone acting in silence, had erased the anomaly. Photographs taken by volunteers showed clear differences between the original discovery and the altered landscape. "Cleansed," one ranger later muttered in an off-record conversation. Rumors circulated that the FBI had taken more than just the shoes. Families began hearing whispers that a fragment of clothing, possibly Alicia's light jacket, had been recovered near the spiral but never entered into evidence logs. No official document confirmed this, but two volunteers swore they saw a bagged textile removed from the site before federal agents cleared them out. When asked, agents denied the claim outright. Meanwhile, local legends resurfaced with force. Anthropologists who studied Pueblo petroglyphs pointed to spirals carved into rock faces across New Mexico. Some represented water, others the sun, still others the path of migration. But elders from one pueblo told investigators quietly that spirals marked boundaries, places where the living should not linger. Oral tradition described offerings left at these sites, food, clothing, even footwear, as symbols of journeys incomplete. The spiral of shoes fit uneasily into this framework. Back in Albuquerque, Alicia's sister began combing through her phone records and social media. She found a half-drafted message on Alicia's account, unsent, dated July 9th, the night before they vanished. It read only, "We thought we heard." The text stopped there. Analysts dismissed it as a glitch or accidental save, but for her sister, it was proof that something unsettled had occurred before contact was lost. Independent investigators also focused on anomalies in the search records. Several dispatch logs from July 12th and 13 contained gaps, 10 to 15 minutes of missing audio. When technicians attempted to retrieve backups, they were told the files had been corrupted. Volunteers who had monitored scanners at the time recalled transmissions breaking into static, punctuated by odd rhythmic sounds like tapping or knocking. These details were never acknowledged in final reports. One retired ranger, speaking anonymously years later, described his unease during the search. "There was a silence out there. No birds, no wind, like the air was waiting. We found nothing, but I kept the feeling that we weren't alone." His statement was never included in the official file, but recordings of his testimony circulated among investigators and fueled speculation. Forensic details only deepened the puzzle. Soil samples from the spiral site revealed plant matter from multiple ecosystems: alpine pine needles, desert mesquite fragments, even traces of saltbush found far to the south. It was as if the materials had been carried from across the state and deposited together. Analysts admitted privately they could not explain the mixture, but the public report reduced the finding to normal environmental contamination. As August turned to September, the case slipped out of headlines. Without bodies, without new evidence, authorities treated it as another unsolved disappearance in a vast wilderness. But for those who had walked the search grids, sifted the sand, or seen the spiral with their own eyes, the silence rang hollow. Something had happened in the Manzano Mountains in 2011, something more deliberate than misadventure. The unanswered question remained, were Alicia and Brian victims of human hands, drawn into something ritualistic, criminal, or cultic, or had they stumbled into a pattern older than memory, one the desert had recorded not in bodies, but in the geometry of shoes? The absence of answers left families staring into the void, haunted not only by the loss, but by the sense that evidence had been buried along with the truth. By the 5th month after Alicia and Brian's disappearance, the official narrative had hardened into silence. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department stopped issuing updates, and the FBI presence evaporated without explanation. The case file listed them as missing, presumed deceased, yet their families refused to accept that designation. For them, the unanswered questions were too many. Why had the spiral been so carefully erased? Why were dispatch logs corrupted? And why were federal agents treating a missing hiker case as though it carried national security weight? Independent researchers filled the vacuum. A group calling themselves the New Mexico Missing Project, composed of former law enforcement, journalists, and local volunteers, began assembling a shadow archive. They filed FOIA requests, interviewed witnesses overlooked by authorities, and mapped other cases of disappearances in the region. What they found disturbed them. Over the previous 3 decades, at least 9 separate disappearances had been logged within a 60-mile radius of the Manzano Mountains. Most were hikers or campers. In each case, the trail of evidence ended abruptly, just as it had with Alicia and Brian. Patterns emerged. In 1994, 2 hunters vanished near Cedro Peak. Their rifles and packs were later found stacked neatly against a tree. In 2002, a solo hiker disappeared, leaving only his shoes in a circle near a dried spring. None of these details were widely reported at the time. When researchers compared soil samples from those cases, archived at the University of New Mexico, they found anomalies similar to the spiral site, plant matter and soil types inconsistent with the immediate terrain. Family members, desperate for answers, hired a private drone operator in early 2012 to revisit the area where the spiral had been discovered. His footage captured something unsettling. At first glance, the ridgeline appeared barren, but when the drone banked lower, it revealed fresh cairns, small stacks of 3 stones, set at intervals along an arroyo. They formed a line stretching half a mile, pointing directly toward the place where the spiral had once been. Rangers dismissed the cairns as trail markers made by hikers, but hikers familiar with the area swore no established paths ran through that canyon. Witness accounts trickled in with similar oddities. A local couple driving on State Road 337 late at night reported seeing figures on the ridge, standing still in pairs, not moving. When deputies checked the location the next morning, no tracks were found. Another hiker claimed he heard the sound of shoes scuffing in sand behind him on a solitary trek, though he was alone. His phone later recorded a corrupted audio file, 30 seconds of static punctuated by 3 loud knocks. Forensic breakthroughs were hinted at but never released. An insider at the state crime lab leaked that at least one of the shoes recovered from the spiral contained DNA trace not belonging to Alicia or Brian. The fragmentary profile matched neither missing persons databases nor known offenders. The report, stamped confidential, was never acknowledged publicly. Psychological tolls mounted. Alicia's sister began receiving anonymous calls, silent at first, then a faint rustling sound before the line went dead. Brian's father reported finding stacked stones on his property outside Albuquerque, formations identical to those photographed in the arroyos. Police dismissed it as coincidence. As winter set in, the families realized they were alone against an official wall of denials. But the evidence, the spiral, the cairns, the corrupted recordings, and the whispers of other vanished hikers suggested a continuity too deliberate to ignore. Something moved through those mountains, leaving patterns instead of bodies, geometry instead of answers. By then, the case had shifted from a local tragedy into something larger, not just the story of two young lives lost, but the suggestion of a hidden pattern across decades, one that officials seemed more intent on burying than solving. For the families, the silence was not closure, it was a cover. And in that cover, the real story seemed to be hiding, waiting for anyone willing to keep asking what really happened in the desert that summer. By the 6th year after Alicia and Brian vanished, the case no longer resembled a missing persons file so much as a scattered archive of contradictions, whispers, and fragments. Official reports still cited environmental exposure, probable fatality, but beneath that sterile phrase sat layers of inconsistencies that investigators never resolved. Independent researchers pressed harder, convinced that the spiral of shoes was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader pattern that authorities had quietly tracked for decades. In 2017, a journalist with the Santa Fe Gazette obtained internal Park Service memoranda through a partial FOIA release. Buried in the files were references to recurrent symbolic artifacts found in remote areas of New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado between 1983 and 2010. The term was never explained, but marginal notes referenced clothing clusters, arranged footwear, and anomalous cairn lines. These findings were always logged, photographed, and then redacted from final public summaries. One document listed the July 2011 spiral as Case 44. If there were at least 43 earlier examples, why had none been acknowledged? Around the same time, forensic specialists re-examined Alicia's sneakers and Brian's boots, which had been preserved in sealed evidence. DNA swabs taken in 2011 had already confirmed they belonged to the couple, but additional trace samples, overlooked in the initial analysis, revealed skin cells from at least two unidentified individuals. The degraded fragments were not sufficient to build a full profile, but they excluded immediate family members and search responders. The lab report was marked non-probative and filed away. Families were never informed. Volunteers continued exploring the Manzano foothills with drones and mapping tools. In April 2017, one team captured high-resolution images of a dry canyon 3 miles from the original site. At first, the canyon looked empty, but when the photographs were enhanced, faint outlines appeared, parallel lines of lighter soil curving inwards. On the ground, they found nothing but scattered stones. Yet magnetometer readings taken at the site showed unusual spikes, as if metallic objects had once been buried shallowly and then removed. The report was published in an independent archive, dismissed by law enforcement as geological anomaly. The psychological pressure on those connected to the case was severe. Rangers who had been part of the initial search described recurring dreams of being followed, of footsteps pacing just behind them on silent trails. One ranger confided that his K9, who had alerted in 2011 and then refused to move forward, continued to panic whenever brought near that sector, even years later. Local communities, meanwhile, began to share their own pieces of oral history. An elder from the Isleta Pueblo told researchers about the path of lost shoes, a phrase from older stories describing spirits who lured travelers into leaving behind footwear in spirals or circles as offerings. The story had always been regarded as metaphorical, but the details, the spiral, the deliberate placement, the absence of footprints, mirrored the 2011 discovery too closely to dismiss as coincidence. By late 2017, Mercer's case, now cited alongside Alicia and Brian's disappearance by independent investigators, became part of a broader theory. The Trail Anomaly Project compiled a list of 37 disappearances across the Southwest with overlapping markers, abrupt loss of tracks, cairns arranged in unnatural lines, missing footwear, and corrupted communications equipment. In at least 12 of those cases, radio logs contained unexplained gaps, In others, recovered items bore soil signatures inconsistent with their environment, just as Alicia's shoes had. The FBI maintained its silence. Requests for comment were returned with identical form letters. No further information available. Yet a leaked internal email from 2015, later verified, instructed agents to classify such incidents under environmental hazards, non-criminal. The wording suggested bureaucratic containment more than resolution. For Alicia and Brian's families, each revelation only deepened the wound. They believed the spiral was more than evidence. It was a message, left either by whoever took them or by something older, something that had repeated across decades. "It's not just about our kids anymore," Brian's father said in an interview. "It's about how many others went missing the same way, and why no one wants to talk about it." By the 6th year, the case had shifted from grief to a broader dread. What began as 2 missing hikers now looked like part of a network of vanishings, threaded together by shoes, spirals, and silence. The question was no longer simply what happened to Alicia and Brian, but whether the wilderness itself was marked by a presence, one that arranged its evidence carefully, geometrically, and always just beyond explanation. By 2018, the case had taken on the shape of a rift between what the families and independent investigators believed and what officials were willing to admit. Alicia and Brian's disappearance was no longer just a missing person story. It had become a contested narrative, whispered about in ranger stations, dissected in late-night forums, and pulled apart by journalists who knew they were up against more than silence. That spring, a graduate researcher at the University of New Mexico published a thesis on unresolved disappearances in the Southwest. One section referenced the 2011 spiral indirectly, calling it a recovered anomalous artifact. Buried in a footnote was a more disturbing detail. In at least 4 other cases across New Mexico, footwear was found deliberately arranged in geometric shapes, triangles, lines, circles, always far from established trails. The thesis committee forced the author to revise the section before publication, but copies of the draft circulated quietly among investigators. At the same time, a former FBI field technician came forward anonymously to a Santa Fe reporter. He claimed that during evidence analysis of the spiral, lab instruments recorded electromagnetic interference around the shoes, enough to briefly disrupt sensitive sensors. He described it as residual, like the items had been exposed to a field not naturally occurring. His testimony was impossible to verify, but the specificity of his account mirrored anomalies logged in Mercer's disappearance years earlier. Static bursts on radios, corrupted recordings. Civilian volunteers kept pressing deeper into the Manzanos. In June, one team found cairns lining a ridge, but these were unlike the casual stacks hikers build. Each pile contained fragments of fabric, shreds of clothing knotted around the stones. Lab tests later showed some of the fibers were polyester blends not manufactured before the 1990s, while others were wool consistent with older outdoor gear. None matched Alicia or Brian, but the mixture suggested the cairns had been built over decades, as though each disappearance added a new piece. Witness testimony also resurfaced. A former ranch hand, long reluctant to speak publicly, told investigators he remembered hearing a low, steady hum across the canyon the week the couple vanished. He had assumed it was aircraft, but later realized no planes had flown in that corridor. His account echoed older reports gathered by the Trail Anomaly Project, unexplained humming, metallic knocking, and sometimes a sense of being paced by unseen steps. The families themselves grew more vocal. Alicia's sister accused federal agencies of deliberate suppression, pointing to missing audio logs, withheld photographs, and unexplained redactions. Brian's father began compiling a private dossier, maps, soil reports, and leaked photographs of the spiral. In interviews, he said, "The pattern isn't random, it's repetition. Every time they clean it up before anyone notices. They just couldn't erase this one fast enough." The psychological strain deepened. Volunteers described unsettling dreams after visiting the search site, endless spirals in sand, voices calling from ridges, and the sensation of walking barefoot across sharp stone. A psychologist who studied search and rescue trauma noted the unusual consistency of these dreams, suggesting they reflected more than ordinary stress. By year's end, the case had reached a threshold. Too many independent findings, shoes from different decades, fibers from unknown origins, electromagnetic anomalies, aligned with local folklore about watchers and spirals. Official agencies clung to the explanation of misadventure, but their refusal to engage with the evidence created an opposite effect. The stronger the denials, the more the suspicion grew. 2018 marked the moment when Alicia and Brian's disappearance was no longer viewed in isolation. Instead, it became part of a documented sequence of vanishings, strange artifacts, and erased evidence spanning decades. For their families, that shift was devastating. Their children's absence was no longer just a tragedy, it was evidence of something larger, an enduring presence in the wilderness that officials seemed determined not to name. By 2019, the investigation into Alicia and Brian's disappearance reached what many independent researchers began calling the inflection point. Enough evidence had surfaced through leaks, witness accounts, and suppressed documents that the official explanation of misadventure no longer carried weight outside government circles, yet every new layer of discovery seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind gaps, redactions, and silences that only deepened the mystery. The year began with the release of previously unseen drone footage taken by volunteers in 2012. The video, quietly uploaded to an online archive, showed a second spiral formation, smaller than the first, but unmistakably deliberate. This spiral was constructed not of shoes, but of stones, each marked with scraps of cloth tied around them. Forensic analysis of the fabric revealed traces of synthetic dyes discontinued in the 1980s, alongside modern blends still in circulation. The implication was chilling. These spirals had been appearing for decades, perhaps added to gradually by unknown hands. Within weeks of the footage being noticed, the archive was taken offline without explanation. Dispatch logs obtained that summer revealed another anomaly. On July 14, 2011, 5 days after the couple vanished, searchers in Sector Delta reported hearing intermittent radio clicks, not coming from their own channel. Technicians later suggested it resembled Morse code, though the sequence was incomplete and broken by static. A volunteer ham operator who reviewed the log noted the clicks spelled fragments of the word turn. This detail was never acknowledged in the final report, though the raw log remained in the archive of the Trail Anomaly Project. Local accounts added more strangeness. A hunter reported stumbling on a clearing that year where shoes were nailed to trees at shoulder height, dozens of them, weather-worn and in various states of decay. By the time investigators arrived, the trees were bare. The hunter insisted he had not imagined it. His testimony was dismissed as unreliable, yet his description of the shoes, sizes, brands, even a child's sandal, matched items later confirmed as missing in unrelated cases across New Mexico. The families pressed harder. Alicia's mother filed suit against the county, demanding release of full photographs of the spiral. In court filings, the sheriff's department admitted evidentiary photographs exist, but claimed they had been classified under a joint federal review. No explanation followed. The case was dismissed on grounds of national security. For the families, this was the most devastating confirmation yet, that their children's disappearance had been pulled into a sphere far beyond a simple missing hiker case. Journalists uncovered another piece of the puzzle in late 2019. Through interviews with retired Park Service staff, they learned of an unpublished internal study titled Anomalous Trail Incidents, 1981-2009. The study cataloged disappearances across several states, noting repeated markers, sudden loss of scent trails, stacked stones, footwear arranged in patterns, and corrupted communications. According to one source, The study recommended further classified research into environmental anomalies. The document was never released, but its rumored existence aligned with what independent investigators had already compiled. Meanwhile, hikers who ventured into the Manzano Mountains that year began reporting their own unnerving encounters. One group found a trail camera they had set up crushed, as if by immense force, its memory card corrupted. Another described hearing footsteps pacing them at night, only to find cairns erected outside their tents by morning. When these reports were shared online, officials dismissed them as fabrications, yet their similarity to Mercer's journal entries from another disappearance years earlier was undeniable. By the close of 2019, the case had shifted irreversibly. What had begun as the story of two young people who vanished in the desert was now entangled in a pattern spanning decades, connected by spirals, cairns, footwear, and unexplained interference. The official silence, once seen as bureaucratic inertia, now looked deliberate. An effort not just to withhold details, but to bury a phenomenon that resisted categorization. For Alicia and Brian's families, the 8th year marked no progress toward closure. Instead, it left them confronting a far darker realization that their children's absence might not be an isolated event, but part of something systematic, something that had happened before and could happen again. And if so, the real question was no longer where they had gone, but what had been waiting for them out there, arranging the ground in spirals no one wanted to explain. By the summer of 2020, nearly a decade after Alicia and Brian vanished, the official record remained sealed, the photographs of the spiral withheld, and the families left with only silence. But silence does not erase memory. It only amplifies the fragments that slip through. And in 2020, those fragments began surfacing in ways that shifted the entire narrative from tragedy into something far more unsettling. A leaked report from a forensic contractor provided one of the first breakthroughs. The document, marked "for internal use only," described the shoes recovered from the spiral as containing microscopic residues of metallic dust, not native to the Manzano region. The dust was identified as a rare alloy used in aerospace manufacturing, particularly in facilities tied to Sandia Laboratories less than 50 miles away. There was no official explanation for how fragments of aerospace alloys ended up inside decades-old footwear found in the desert. The lab's spokesperson denied any connection, but for the families, the discovery widened the mystery. Were Alicia and Brian caught in something larger than misadventure, something brushed against by classified research? Radio logs uncovered that same year deepened the unease. Independent investigators who analyzed the corrupted files from July 2011 used signal restoration software to recover partial audio. What emerged was 20 seconds of layered static and 3 discernible knocks, followed by a faint voice whispering, "Still here." Audio technicians admitted the phrase could be pareidolia, human tendency to find meaning in noise, but the pattern of the knocks matched earlier anomalies recorded in other disappearances. Civilian accounts piled on. In February 2020, a group of hikers reported discovering shoes in a shallow cave near Cedro Peak, arranged in a semicircle facing outward as if warding something off. When they returned with deputies 2 days later, the cave was empty, its floor swept clean. In March, a local rancher claimed to see lights descending the ridge in formation, bluish orbs moving silently before vanishing. He described the same area where the original spiral had been found. Rangers recorded his statement, but it was omitted from official logs. The psychological impact on those closest to the case worsened. Alicia's sister began receiving photographs from an untraceable email address. Each image showed desert ground, marked by crude spirals scratched into the sand with sticks. Some included shoes, single, mismatched, often child-sized, placed at the edges. Investigators traced the IP address to a public Wi-Fi hub in Albuquerque and declared the emails a hoax. Yet when the family compared the terrain in the photographs, Some landmarks matched locations inside the restricted search zones from 2011. By autumn, the Trail Anomaly Project released a second report cataloging new cases across the Southwest. One entry detailed a disappearance near Ruidoso in 2015, where rescuers found a spiral of animal bones in the forest. Another noted a 1998 case in Arizona, where a missing man's belt and shoes were arranged in concentric circles. These patterns, once anecdotal, now appeared systematically across decades and locations. The FBI's response was terse. A spokesperson insisted, "No evidence links these cases. Similarities are coincidental." But in leaked internal slides from a training seminar, one bullet point read, "Spiral markers, containment priority." The phrasing was bureaucratic, but its meaning unmistakable. The government recognized the spirals, but only as something to control, not to explain. For the families, the 9th year left them in a liminal place between grief and terror. They no longer asked only, "Where are Alicia and Brian?" They asked, "Why are these spirals repeating across the Southwest, and why are they always erased?" The official narrative still insisted on misadventure, but the ground itself, with its cairns, spirals, and untraceable artifacts, told another story, one of recurrence, concealment, and something moving in silence along the ridges. By the close of 2020, the absence of bodies was less haunting than the presence of patterns. Alicia and Brian had vanished into the desert, but what lingered was geometry, footprints that ended abruptly, signals that cut into static, and the suggestion that whatever arranged the shoes had not stopped. It was still out there, repeating the same quiet design, waiting for someone else to stumble into its spiral. 10 years after Alicia and Brian vanished into the desert, their case is no longer remembered as a simple missing persons file. It has become a legend, a cautionary tale, and an unquiet dossier, threaded with redactions and fragments. The official line remains unchanged. 2 young hikers lost to the elements. But the silence of those reports says more than words. Behind every denial, every blurred photograph, every corrupted dispatch log lies the outline of something no one has dared to name. The legacy of the spiral is what endures. Forensic specialists who handled the shoes admit quietly that nothing about the formation made sense. Soil types pulled from far-flung regions, footwear spanning decades, traces of alloys that belonged to labs, not mountains. Rangers who walked those grids still recall the silence, the sense of being watched, the sudden refusal of their dogs to move forward. Hikers who came years later whisper of cairns rebuilt overnight, of lights threading down ridges, of footsteps pacing them at dusk. The Manzano Mountains became more than terrain. They became a threshold, a place where stories align too neatly with symbols carved in stone centuries before. For Alicia and Brian's families, the years have blurred the line between grief and suspicion. They never received the photographs of the spiral in full, never received the missing dispatch tapes, never received the unredacted forensic results. What they did receive were fragments. An unfinished text on Alicia's phone, blurred drone footage, anonymous emails with spirals drawn in sand. Each piece pointed to the same conclusion, that what happened was not random, that someone, or something, arranged it deliberately, then erased the evidence. In popular memory, the story has fused with older tales. Pueblo elders speak of watchers, spirits who mark journeys with spirals. Amateur researchers connect the case to other vanishings. Hunters whose rifles were stacked neatly, hikers whose shoes were found in circles, families who left without trace. Patterns repeat, spirals reappear, and always the conclusion is withheld. The geometry is what remains, a language of disappearance that no official file will translate. Psychologists studying the case describe a new phenomenon, the haunting of the absence itself. It is not just the couple who are missing, but the certainty of what happened. The erasure becomes part of the trauma. Each unanswered question, why the soil samples mismatched, why dispatch logs went silent, why the spiral was cleared within days, becomes its own wound. In the end, the case leaves more echoes than answers. A decade later, hikers still stumble across fresh cairns, new spirals carved shallow into the sand, and sometimes a single shoe left upright where no path runs. Officials dismiss these as pranks, but the echoes grow too consistent to ignore. They point not to a single event in 2011, but to a pattern repeating across landscapes and decades. What happened to Alicia and Brian? Were they taken by human hands, drawn into something ritualistic or violent, or did they step across a threshold older than memory? Did the spiral mark their ending, or their passage to somewhere no one can follow? The final line of the file reads, "Subjects not located." But the silence, the erasures, and the patterns left behind suggest something more enduring. Perhaps the better question is not where they went, but what remains on the desert floor. Spirals, cairns, footprints that stop suddenly, and whether the design is finished or still unfolding. The case ends as it began, with a void. And in that void, the audience is left to ask the question, officials never will, what really happened out there, and who is arranging the ground in spirals that outlast the living?